Hello and welcome. Today I want to discuss something very close to my heart. Conspiracy theories. I love conspiracies because they keep us skeptical. They keep us from accepting everything authority figures tell us. Now you may ask, do I believe them? Well, some I do, most I don't. It's entirely based on the evidence. I think if you replace believing in one authority without question with believing in another authority without question, you haven't really improved your mindset. So today, let's dive in with a very popular, very interesting story, Project Rainbow, or the Philadelphia Experiment. Here's the story. In 1955, a well-respected astronomer with a master's in science named Morris K. Jessup wrote a novel called The Case for the UFO. It was an attempt to create a serious essay that would legitimize the research into UFO technology. The issue, of course, was that this was at the height of UFO hysteria, meaning that Jessup was ridiculed despite his novel being very well written and very well researched. Having read it myself, I believe it to be a great argument in favor of belief in UFOs. In 1956, Jessup received 2 letters from a man calling himself Carlos Allende. Ole. Jessup dismissed these letters as the crazy ramblings of a madman and thought no more of them. Then, in July of 1956, Jessup was invited to the Office of Naval Research. Officials in the Navy presented Jessup with a copy of his own book, annotated with the crazy writings of the stranger Carlos Miguel Allende. The book mentions a bizarre story, one that particularly piques the interest of the naval officials. The experiment itself, or the story within the story, goes like this. The story briefly and without much detail describes a 1943 secret government experiment in Philadelphia to make a ship not only invisible to radar, but virtually invisible to the naked eye. But the experiment went terribly wrong. When the ship vanished, it apparently teleported to Norfolk, Virginia, don't ask why, and then reappeared in Philly. Boarding the ship, they found many crew members dead, and those who lived had fell into a deep madness. But worst of all, many were fused into the metal of the ship, barely alive, mutated into half-man, half-steel abominations. I really enjoy this story, I don't know if you can tell. This disturbing story fascinated Jessup and the officials. Jessup told them of the letters and the man's name, Carlos Miguel Allende, but nothing ever came of it. Allende was a phantom. As this information later came out, many would question why the naval officers even took an interest in it at all. A reasonable question. In 1957, the annotated version of the book was published and received a moderate amount of attention. It became known as the Vero edition of The Case for the UFO, and is still in print today to the best of my knowledge. Again, I do own a copy. In 1958, Jessup turned over his information to Dr. Ivan Sanderson for safekeeping. This was a year before NASA was founded. In January of 1959, Jessup tells Dr. J. Manson Valentine that he had definite conclusions on this book and the Philadelphia experiment. On April 19th, Dr. J. Manson Valentine invited Jessup to dinner the next day. Speculation is that he was about to reveal all that he knew to Valentine, although there is no evidence to back that up. April 20th, Jessup was found dead. He was found in his car, a tube feeding the exhaust into the cockpit. His death was ruled a suicide by gas inhalation. His only obituary was published, rather cruelly, under the title Saucer Man Suicide. I mean, that is pretty messed up, isn't it? Just goes to show, the news media was always corrupt. It's not just in today's world. The story goes that Jessup was killed for what he knew, as he was the only man who knew of the infamous Project Rainbow outside of the Navy, and that Allende, if he was ever found, would meet the same fate. Now, of course, this isn't entirely true, considering that the book was published with the story in it. So, yeah, but we'll leave that a while longer. In 1962, Dr. Riley H. Crabb published Allende's letters to Jessup. In 1956, Vincent Gaddis published a book called Invisible Horizons, True Mysteries of the Sea, in which he recounts the story of the vanishing battleship, exposing the masses to the story in pop culture for the first time. Finally, after much publicity and many people fascinated by the story of the vanishing ship, Carlos Miguel Allende came forward and revealed himself. In 1969, Carlos Allende confessed to the world that his true name was Carl Allen, which is not nearly as fun to say, an actual veteran of the Navy as he claimed. He visited the Vero Corporation, who had published the Vero edition with Allen's annotations, and demanded a sum of money for selling his stories. In July of that same year, Allen confessed at the Aerial Phenomenon Research Organization that he had written all 3 sets of annotations that appear in the Vero edition. He wrote the following on the second page of the copy of the Vero edition that he gave to them. All words, phrases, and sentences underlined on the following pages in brown ink are false. The below page and the top part of the following were and are the craziest pack of lies I ever wrote. Object: to encourage ONR research and to discourage Professor Morris K. Jessup from going further with investigations possibly leading to actual research. Then I feared invisibility and force field research. I don't know. So, let's analyze this story a bit, because it is a fascinating story with a lot of history. First, is it true? Well, actually it is, and it isn't. All of the stuff with Jessup definitely happened, although much of it is left out by theorists. For instance, in 1959, he was invited to dinner after turning over all of his work to a friend for safekeeping. But 18 days earlier, he wrote a long suicide note to his friend Long John Nebel. So his suicide was not by any means out of the blue, and Jessup's daughter even admits
his wife, Marjorie, called to tell me that he had died, and my reaction at the time was to say, how did he do it? So I must have been thinking of him as depressed at that time. It's funny, until you asked that, I hadn't thought of that for a long time. But she said he was dead, and I said, how did he do it?
Whatever else his suicide might have been, it definitely wasn't unexpected by those who knew him. As to why the Navy took an interest in the book, well, it might not have. The Navy actually looks into all claims of this sort. Remember, this was during the Cold War, and it could have been seen as potentially trying to mislead the military. After all, it specifically mentions top-secret naval experiments, and if they verified these experiments didn't happen, it's not out of the question that they might check it out to make sure that Jessup had nothing to do with it. In addition, Allen included his own military ID number in his letters. The Navy probably checked it out, and knowing what they probably knew about Allen's mental state, which we'll discuss in a minute, just dismissed it. This is another point. Although the military never acknowledged or publicly published Carl Allen's name, they definitely knew who sent that book. After all, let's look at this for a second. Isn't it odd that they would just drop it after talking to Jessup if they thought someone knew something like that? They could have easily found Allen with his ID number and silenced him if he'd witnessed an experiment and broke his vow of silence. The idea that he eluded them for decades is just false, since his family still lived in his hometown, and he could have been contacted. Also, why would they allow the Vero edition full of these notes, including notes on the Philadelphia experiment, to be published if it was secret information? It would have been easy to conceal the book's existence. After all, Jessup was out of the way. But no, they allowed it to be published and circulated. Now, some might say that allowing it to be viewed as a conspiracy theory discredits it, but remember that no one would have known it existed at all if they had concealed it, since Allen hadn't told anybody else, and if he did, who would believe one little man? By publishing the book, they added legitimacy to claims that they just didn't need to legitimize. Now, I understand to people who believe in this conspiracy, I might look like I'm just an anti-truther and all that, but this is really something that has been debunked by a well-known paranormal investigator named Robert Gorman, who followed the Philadelphia experiment for years and eventually helped unravel it as a fraud. Gorman has written many columns on the supernatural and appeared on programs such as Unsolved Mysteries, The Unexplained, History's Mysteries, Animal X, Monster Quest, and Dark Matters. His investigatory motto is, "Running away is not investigating, it's running away," which I kinda like. I invite you to have the same attitude as we briefly cover his findings, and then I'll explain a few of my own. Gorman was able to visit Carl Allen's family, and was able to read through many of Allen's fictitious stories, all of them crazy and wild as Project Rainbow. Allen's brothers also testify that Allen his entire life would annotate books he read, even going so far as to cross out the author's original words and rewrite them. Now, they claim he had an extraordinary talent for stories, but he had no talent for writing, and so he would simply edit other authors' works. In addition, many of the things we know about the experiment were added to the story later, after Allen changed his mind and decided to take back his admission that the story was, quote-unquote, the craziest pack of lies he ever wrote, unquote. For instance, it was only later that he specified that the ship was the USS Eldridge, a destroyer escort that he actually did see in real life. Although he gave real details from the ship he had served on, and the Eldridge itself, why didn't he mention it earlier if that was the truth? In fact, he later changed the ship it happened to because he forgot. Yet, he remembers other things with extraordinary clarity. He claims to have plunged his arm halfway to the elbow into that stupendously colossal, whirling, whizzing force field, and then as a result, after this tremendous explosion, clumps of hair came out of his head. Now that's really weird, because that's a result of radiation. Explosive radiation, you might say, considering the way he describes it. Yet, there is no evidence that he suffered from any kind of cancer later on in his life. That level of radiation poisoning would typically be fatal, but even if you did recover, it would take weeks, and Carl never even claimed that he was treated for radiation. And, typically speaking, radiation poisoning is not something you can just walk off. However, another interesting theory about where this story might have come from is that it may have even been a cover-up. When asked, Dr. Frank Cyan said there was an accident in Philadelphia in 1944, but not 43. In September of 44, there was an explosion at a pilot plant, and 2 people were killed and several injured, and because of the security of the time, I think it was covered up. I don't think it's very probable, for one reason. A story like the Philadelphia experiment actually would do more damage than just telling the truth. It's a little bit too outlandish to work as a cover-up story. He changed the date on at least one occasion and added positively just ludicrous embellishments. But let's really get into that instead of generalizing. So he claimed, long after it was public knowledge, that Einstein used his completed unified field theory on the experiment, and that he even had a conversation with Einstein. Now, while Einstein did help the US Navy, there is no evidence of any such experiment. He also claims that Nikola Tesla was involved, which is verifiably false. Also, if Einstein was involved in a project that was literally world-changing like this one, why would they have taken so many publicity photos of him and made his help common knowledge? Now, Carl Allen served on the SS Andrew Furseth, but claimed he had seen the experiment during a time in Philadelphia while serving. One date given for the experiment is July 22nd, 1943, which was actually before the Eldridge was even commissioned. Briefly, I'll go into some more information about these dates. August 10th is a possible date. While on August 13th, Allen did spend a weekend in Philadelphia, the Eldridge was not even there. And it doesn't appear that Allen was even in Philadelphia at any point in October of 1943. The Eldridge wasn't there either, but he was there in August, coincidentally about the same time that the Eldridge was in Newark awaiting orders to be transferred to New York Harbor for a commissioning ceremony. Remember that even though the ship had not been commissioned yet, The crew was still with her. Also, at the time, Carl Allen had yet to be dispatched by the Navy, and did not set foot on the Furiseth until 3 days later, on the 16th. August 17th, the Eldridge and the Furiseth both left Newark and Norfolk respectively, and would have been in visual distance of each other, off of New Jersey. This was Allen's first time aboard the Furiseth, so he definitely would have seen the Eldridge. However, this was in the middle of the ocean, they were going in different directions, and witnesses say that the Eldridge made it to its destination. So this cannot have been the date of the experiment. Remember that the experiment used a skeleton crew, most of whom died, not the original crew who had been with the Eldridge since commissioning. Yet we know that the original crew was on board because the ship was on its way to be commissioned. Also, the Furiseth left a day earlier, October 27th through October 29th, 1943. The date of the experiment. The experiment was executed between 1705 hours or 1720 hours. There are about a dozen issues with this entire situation, but I'll try to keep it brief. The October 27th ship log shows that the Eldridge was in the New York harbor. In addition, the Furiseth set out from Norfolk on October 25th on its way to Orun. It didn't return until January 17th of the next year. That means that the Furiseth wasn't in Philadelphia at that time either. Now sure, they could have faked the ship logs, but why would they do that on a ship that was completely unrelated? Also, they would have had to have been sent somewhere, otherwise eyewitnesses would have known they didn't go to Orun. November 1st through the 7th. Now the Furiseth and the Eldridge could have been within visual distance of each other at this point in time, but that is a big could. Again, this is the middle of the ocean, and the same logistical concerns would apply as would with any experiment taking place in the middle of the ocean. And in addition to that, they simply would not have been as close as Allen has stated that they were. So what difference does it make if it was in the middle of the ocean instead of Philly? Well, first off, the name of the experiment would make no sense, but to be fair, I mean, the name of the actual experiment was Project Rainbow anyway. Well, it would be far less controlled in the open ocean, and control is everything in an experiment. What's more important is we have only one eyewitness suggesting all of this. Yeah, we'll open that can of worms another day. For now, one eyewitness. So here's why it matters. Not only are his dates severely off if the experiment took place in the open ocean, but he would also be wrong about the location. Now, if he got every detail wrong, why should we trust him? The dates and times he gave were very specific. Being off by a day or two, like not knowing if it was the 25th or the 27th, that's excusable. But he mentioned specific dates and times and places and details he remembers. He never once stated that it was in the open ocean. It would be hard to misremember that badly. An event that was so massive you lost all your hair to radiation. People can remember the tie they were wearing on 9/11, but you can't even remember the month? Another problem is the time itself, which was 5 p.m., 1700 hours. So the Navy, in Philadelphia Harbor, in broad daylight, conducted a secret experiment that could have changed the world more than the Trinity experiment did. And they conducted it in a busy harbor where anybody could see it. Now, if it was 500 hours, early morning, maybe. Remember, the Trinity experiment was done out in a desert so that they would have total secrecy. But the experiment that would change the world, like in literal invisibility, we want to do that out in the open. It'll throw the Germans off our trail, guys. Do it out in the open. But the biggest problem I have is with the results of the story itself. The ship disappears, reappears in Norfolk, Virginia, and then pops back into existence back in Philadelphia. But who says? Allen wasn't transported too. Surely he could have heard that from superiors, but who were the eyewitnesses who saw this? I mean, I know that we'll never know because they were silenced, but seriously, who were these eyewitnesses? If he can't even get the dates and times right, why should we believe the teleportation is accurate just purely based on hearsay? Actually, also, Norfolk is a very interesting location, but we'll talk about why in just a minute. Remember, the soldiers were fused to the ship on a molecular level. Allen says that some were buried in the steel, some merged with the walls of the ship and the floorboards. Now let's assume the ones who just went crazy were just committed, and their families were told they were lost at sea. Okay, that's understandable. But those fused into the ship present a massive logistical impossibility. The ship would have had to have been out of commission for more than a month to undergo the necessary repairs. Bulkheads would have to have been torn down and rebuilt. Decking, massive steel plating would have had to all be replaced. Yet we know that the Eldridge left New York on November 2nd to go to Bermuda and then to Block Island. That's 5 days, maximum. And more realistically, just under 4. Bulkheads, steel walls, floorboards, etc., all replaced. And let's assume for a minute that he was being truthful about the radiation, and was just the luckiest man alive to have lived through it, without medical intervention. The ship itself surely would have been affected. I mean, this was 1943. Hardening electrical systems to radiation, that's just not something that was done in 1943, at least not as far as I've been able to find. Yet we know that the Eldridge was never out of commission, and the crew even said that while in dock, they were still on the ship every day. My third issue is the radiation. That type of radiation would have been killing crew members for weeks, or at the very least you would expect a large number of them, a larger number than the average percentage of people, to end up getting cancer at some point in their life. And my fourth issue is that the Furuseth was not meant to be a witness. Not only are you conducting your super duper secret experiment in broad daylight during the rush hour, but you're gonna just let any other naval ship just sit and watch what you're doing? That is a massively unnecessary security risk. But you're insulting the military heinously. This technology would have changed the world, and you think that the US Navy would just let anybody stand around and see it? Remember, this was supposed to be October 27th. Carl had only received his seaman's certificate in August, 2 months earlier. He was the lowest rank. And not only was he allowed to watch, but Einstein, oh my gosh, frickin' Einstein took an interest in him. Ignore the officers who actually have business watching this experiment. I'm gonna go talk to that maggot. Now, some other evidence that theorists claim proves the story is erroneous, but I'll address it quickly anyway. In December, a BBC radio program called Brains Trust featured a discussion by Naval Commander A.B. Campbell, who told a story of a sailor walking through walls. Now, they say that this was only months after the experiment and must be the Eldridge. However, Commander Campbell only served in World War I, left the military, and became a radio broadcaster in 1935, and never went back to the military. If he heard tell of the Eldridge, who told him? Especially since he was English and served in the English, not the US Navy. Also, Brains Trust was a show that often discussed unusual and supernatural events. Talking about a ghostly sailor walking through walls isn't proof of anything, especially since ghosts being able to pass through solid matter is as old as the concept of ghosts. They also, quite bizarrely, bring up the story of a magician named Joseph Dunninger, who was a great magician for his time and who submitted several ideas to the military on how to make ships less visible, quote-unquote. However, it's unknown whether these ideas became anything of worth, and it's unlikely that a magician in 1942 could have known anything about unified field theory. Now, another story is that sailors who were bragging about their ships being made invisible were in a bar one night, and when one soldier tried to shut the others up to stop the secret information from being leaked to the entire bar, a brawl broke out. Nothing odd here, except that during the fight, the soldiers began ghosting, becoming visible and invisible, and according to some, they disappeared entirely. They also claim that a guard for classified audio-visual material, try saying that 3 times fast, saw footage of a destroyer disappear in 1945, but the only source for this is a book called The Philadelphia Experiment, which wasn't even written until 1978 and didn't involve Carl Allen's input at all. In fact, A lot of info comes from this book, which was never verified, including Einstein's involvement. Again, this was 1978, long after Einstein's aid of the US military was public knowledge. If you don't know, also, Charles Berlitz is one of the writers of this book and of many conspiracy-related novels that are infamously unreliable and feature unsubstantiated claims about Atlantis, the Bermuda Triangle, and Roswell. He's infamously unreliable and not even widely respected by other experts in the conspiracy theory fandom, or however that you would brand yourself, truthers. Now, there are little details I might have left out here and there, but I've tried to mention the largest holes in this story, and the simple fact is that this story was propagated on inconsistencies, lies, and marketing whores who just wanted their share, all trying to cash in on a brilliantly grotesque, almost Lovecraftian idea from a man with a peculiar habit of rewriting other people's stories. Yet, there is a grain of truth, like with all conspiracies. There are two bases for this conspiracy that undoubtedly inspired Carl. Number one, the most well-known of these is the degaussing process, the process of making a ship invisible to magnetic mines. These mines would magnetically attach to the hulls, and degaussing would make it so that the mines would not affect them. This is the most common explanation for the invisible ship, and perhaps Alan heard or even talked himself about the ships being made invisible and was inspired by it. In his essay, Anatomy of a Hoax, Jacques F. Vallée interviewed a former Navy service member named Edward Dudgeon. Dudgeon says in this interview, "I was on the destroyer that was there at the same time as the Eldridge DE-173. I can explain all the strange happenings, as we had the same secret equipment on our ship. Our ship was put in dry dock so that they could install high-torque screws. The new screws made a sound of a different pitch, which made it harder for submarines to hear us. They also installed new sonar for underwater detection, and a device called a hedgehog, which was mounted in the front of the forward gun mount on the bow. It fired depth charges in banks of 24 to 30 in a pattern, and could cover 180 degrees as far as about a mile. That was one of the secrets. Your Book of Revelations was wrong about making the ship invisible to radar. The Germans hadn't deployed radar at the time. We were trying to make our ships invisible to magnetic torpedoes by degaussing them. As to the teleportation, Dudgeon also seems to have an explanation. And this is a lesser-known inspiration for the story. Teleportation is even simpler to explain, and it comes with a rather more logical explanation for the bar fight where the sailors disappeared. Killing two birds with one stone, as it were, unless you're a vegan and that sort of thing terrifies you. Dudgeon says, later in the interview, "I was in a bar that evening. We had 2 or 3 beers, and I was one of the 2 sailors who were said to have disappeared mysteriously. The fight started when some of the sailors bragged about the secret equipment, radar, sonar, special screws, a new compass, etc., and were told to keep their mouths shut. 2 of us were minors. The waitresses scooted us out the back door as soon as trouble began, and later denied knowing anything about us." So the disappearing soldiers may also have a basis in fact. The soldiers were really trying to keep their secret invisibility equipment from being blurted out all over the bar. A brawl did ensue, and the soldiers did disappear out the back door. It's understandable why she did deny it, to keep the secret tech a secret, so anyone who claimed to have heard it would be discredited. After all, how could it happen if they were never even there? But it's also understandable that when the waitresses denied them ever being there, they might get suspicious. So, what about the actual teleportation? Quote, "We were leaving at 2 in the morning. The Eldridge had already left at 11 p.m. Someone looking at the harbor that night might have noticed that the Eldridge wasn't there anymore and did appear in Norfolk. It was back in Philadelphia Harbor the next morning, which seems an impossible feat. If you look at a map, you'll see that the merchant ships would have taken 2 days to make that trip. They would have required pilots to go around the submarine nets, the mines, and so on, at the harbor entrances to the Atlantic. But the Navy used a special inland channel, the Chesapeake-Delaware Canal, that bypassed all that. We made the trip in about 6 hours. So there you have it. It would be a massive coinky-dink that it appeared in Norfolk, Virginia, of all places, when there was a channel leading right there from the same area. So it seems all of this was thought up by a sailor who witnessed several real-life events and fictionalized them. It's just as simple as that. Now to end this, I want to say again that while I find a lot of conspiracy theories to be fun and intriguing, I only base my belief in them on evidence. Many have been proven to be real, but we can't let our hunger for a good story get in the way of our reason. As a filmmaker, I'm always interested in a good story, and the Philadelphia experiment is certainly that. The film based on the mythical ship is even pretty fun, and I think a remake of it could be welcome as well. Oh, but at least one person will mention the second half of this theory that I left out. How I wish we lived in a world where the name Al Bielek was never uttered by humans, but sadly this is the reality we live in. I will be addressing Al Bielek and his positively laughable claims in another video where I'll briefly gloss over the Philadelphia experiment. But no one could have the strength to go through the veritable library of bullshit that Al Bielek wrote and spoke about in one day, so I'm gonna quit for now. Thank you everyone for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. If you enjoy conversations about film, filmmaking, and even more conspiracy-related documentaries, subscribe because I'll be uploading hopefully every week to every 2 weeks. Thanks everybody, and I'll see you in the next one.